Man, you may be seated. My 12th birthday party was awesome, which just lands that memory so well in my mind that I can remember it. It was in 6th grade, and I invited a bunch of my church friends over to my house, invited a bunch of my school friends over. It was a slumber party birthday party, and we were going to stay up really, really late. I don't know how late we stayed up, but really the best part of it was that I had my closest favorite friends around me, and together, near the end of the night, we were going to go downstairs into the basement, gather around, and together watch Commando. Arnold Schwarzenegger, full glory, muscles, guns, Uzis, rocket launchers, a knife when he needed it, and he was going to fight the bad guy, defeat the Russians, rescue his daughter, and it was awesome. I should probably tell you, it was not the rented version. It was not the movie theater version. There was no way in the world my mom and dad were going to let that happen. It was the made-for-TV version, which took out some of the language, probably some of the violence. I'm not sure. And so you know for sure, like when that was being broadcast, I was ready, and I had my, analog DVR with the removable media all ready, and nobody got that joke. That was a nerd joke. Nobody would get that. Anyways, I was ready, and I taped it, and I made sure that tape had my name on it so that nobody would tape over it, because I think I wore out Commando. And I don't know if I'm the only 40-year-old who ever remembers and lived by, Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger fighting the bad guys, killing lots of people, because it was awesome. I wore it out. Why? Because when you're in 6th grade, and you've graduated from the little green army guys to G.I. Joe to Commando, it is pretty cool. And anytime we're killing a bunch of bad guys, it's pretty cool, because when you're in 6th grade, you have this fascination with war and heroes and the warriors. So then, when my dad encourages me to start reading through my Bible, and I pick it up and I read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then the review lesson of Deuteronomy, and I'm like, man, this is boring, but I got to keep doing it because my dad wants me to do it. Then when I got into the book of Joshua, then it got real. And it was like, oh yeah, now this is the stuff, this is some good material here, because there's wars and warriors, and Joshua and the Israelites, they're going into towns, driving them out, and they're killing the bad guys, and it's awesome. And then you get into the book of Judges, and there you find the real live historical commandos. I mean, you see these guys, and they are rough, and they are tough, and they don't even need rocket launchers and bazookas and Uzis. They just, they find whatever's around and they tear things up and kill the bad guys. And I remember reading this for the first time, and I'm like, this is awesome. Well, then reading these stories again as a college student, when you're kind of pushed to think beyond your own little world and your own experience, and one of the important things we learn in life, it's important to read a story and try to see it from different perspectives and put yourself in the shoes of each of the characters, and realizing, I don't know about this. I mean, as a 12-year-old with this fascination with war and heroes, kind of removed from the violence that some people see and experience in life, I saw it a lot differently, but trying to see it from another perspective. Then having a family, and being responsible with a wife that I love and 2 kids that I love, and reading some of these stories, recognizing that every one of these people, even the bad guys, there was a mother, and there were wives, kids at home who were mourning their loss. That every person who dies is mourned by someone, and that there is a lot of death and violence, even that's celebrated in the Bible. And that's hard to wrap your head around. And then you get to the New Testament where Jesus says we're supposed to love our enemies and we're supposed to turn the other cheek, and I don't quite know what to do with that. I mean, I can't just say New Testament is the nice God, the Old Testament is the mean God, like God had just a change of opinion or that doesn't work. I can't do that. So how do I wrap my head around this? That's what we're going to talk about today. Last week, we talked about in our church family, we're going to take several weeks and look at the book of Judges, just kind of sensing that it's time for us to really dig in deep to a book of the Bible, and kind of work through it. And one of the things that we find, and if you've been doing your hydrate Bible readings, because we believe in staying spiritually hydrated, right? on our own throughout the week with God. And so this week, if you read through and you read Judges chapter 1, 2, and 3, you already experienced some of that. And you were probably like, what in the world? This is in the Bible. Yes, it is. And so it may have tasted like some sour hydrating water this week. I don't know. But it's not easy to deal with. And so today, what I thought we'd do is, because we're going to read these crazy stories, and I don't want us to just keep tripping over this question week after week of why is there so much violence. Let's just take one day and let's really dig in and let's ask the question, does God condone violence? So we're going to ask the very real question. By the way, if you did pick up your discussion questions and Bible readings for this week, it does have the wrong date on it, but it is the correct, it says January 3rd and 4th, but it is the correct ones for this week. So someday I'll get a clue and figure out how to pay attention to details. But regardless, let's move on today. Here's another reason we need to deal with this. If you've grown up in church, you just read these stories your whole life and maybe never even really thought twice about them. And you just kind of believed them ever since you were a kid and you don't understand what the big problem is. We got to understand just how difficult it is to wrestle with these stories. And if we want to look at other religions of the world and wonder why they're so violent or even accuse them of violence, we've got to deal with the violence in our own story. And we've got to get honest with it and talk about just how difficult it is to deal with it. So here we go. Let's dive in and let's today ask the question, does God condone violence? Turn to the book of Judges, if you would, while you're finding that. We're just going to start off right at the beginning. Judges chapter 1, verse 1. As we get into it, I want you to know I'll probably not answer all of your questions today. This is a difficult subject. What I hope to do is to add some thoughts to your thought process. So to help you, give you an idea and some concepts as you wrestle through this very, very difficult subject, to kind of move from a simplistic view to an informed view. That's my hope today. And so we'll look at these stories, 5 truths, and then we'll look about what Jesus had to say about it. So here we go. In the book of Judges, here's how the story starts off. And I'll just start from the beginning because 5 verses in, we read something crazy. Here it is. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" And the Lord answered, "Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands." So the men of Judah then said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, "Come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites, and we will in turn go with you into yours." So the Simeonites went with them. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they found Adonai-Bezek, and they fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adonai-Bezek fled, but they chased him, and they caught him, and they cut off his thumbs and big toes. Yes, that's really in there. I didn't just change it to see if you were paying attention. That's actually what it says. That's in the Bible. You're like, what in the world? They track down the king, they tackle him, and they cut off his thumbs and big toes. They torture him? Really? And these were godly people that did this? This almost sounds like something that you could be like war crimes tribunal time or something like that. This is in the Bible? So here's the first thing you can write down. First thing to kind of add to your thought process as you wrestle through this question, and that is this. God does not whitewash history, but tells it just as it happened. Well, one of the critiques that people will bring against kind of the Bible and our faith is that the Bible is not a book from God, but it is just a book of man-made stories, supposedly about God, that people in power wrote to try to oppress other people and to get them to obey and to manipulate them through religious manipulation. Here's the problem with that, though. When you invent a story to try to manipulate somebody, you write it so that you look good and so that your God looks good. And so you don't really tell stories that make you look bad or that makes your God look bad. If this is all just kind of invented stuff, we wouldn't have a story that includes, terrorizing another leader and torturing another leader. Imagine that, God wanting to make himself look good, when whoever wrote Judges is writing it all down and he gets to this part, he's like, oh, let's leave out the thumbs and big toes part. Let's just say that they caught him and they incapacitated him from further affliction on other people. Let's just leave it to the imagination. That doesn't make me look very good that my people are chopping off appendages. But that's what happened. And that's what they did, like it or not. Even if God, it wasn't how he wanted them to do it. I don't know. That's a possibility that they weren't really doing what God wanted in that moment. We're going to talk about that today. But what does God do? He just allows them to write the story and tell the story as it happened, not trying to whitewash history to make himself look good. And if that is how God does it throughout the story, could it be that even the stuff that seems too good to be true really happened as well? And those weren't just made up. So that's the first thing you can kind of add. But we need to keep reading. Because if we were just to stop there, it might sound as if they went way overboard and they're just torturing this guy because they defeated him. But here's the rest of the story. Here's what you need to add to your understanding here to really fully understand the story. Look at verse 7. Then Adoni-Bezek said to himself, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. And now God has paid me back for what I did to them. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. In other words, this is not just an abusive emotional reaction that somebody's like, hey, we caught the king. What should we do to him? I don't know. Let's cut off. This wasn't just something they invented in the moment. You see, this guy had a history. He had a reputation. He was known for how he treated his prisoners, and when he went in and he attacked a city, he took the king captive, and with 70 kings cut off thumbs and big toes, humiliated them, took them from their position of honor and power in their palaces, and brought them to his palace, where, missing thumbs and big toes, they begged at his table as servants and beggars. And he had this history of abusing his prisoners, and what happens to him is simply the same thing he has done, not once, but 70 times over. And he recognizes that he is getting back exactly what he has done to others. Now, I understand that we can struggle with that one, and we probably should, but here's another thing you can write down to kind of add to your thought process here. Usually justice is restorative, but sometimes it's retributive. Here's what we mean by that. If you have a teenager and they get the keys to the car and they have their own car and they get a speeding ticket because they are driving recklessly and way too fast and dangerous, as a parent, you take the keys away and you say, you abuse your privileges and you don't understand what a privilege is to have a car, so I'm taking your car and you're never getting it back. Now, I mean, you might think that or you might say that, but you don't really mean that, right? I mean, you're going to give them the car back, mostly because it's such a hassle if you have to taxi them around all the time. It's like for your convenience that they're getting the car anyways. But your goal is that you want to give them the keys back. And so you take the keys and you say for 30 days the next month, you're going to have to bum a ride from your friends, and you're going to see just how embarrassing it is and how much of a hassle it is, how embarrassing it is to have mom and dad dropping you off at school even though you're 17. And no, we're not going to drop you off a block of the way. We're driving right up to the front of those doors of the school to drop you off because we want you to learn the value and the privilege of having a set of car keys, and so that you will be mature and responsible, right? You want them to learn their lesson. You have the full intention of giving the keys back. That is called restorative justice. You want them to learn their lesson. Retributive justice is simply the person gets back to them exactly what they did, with no intention of restoring any privileges. That's usually not the best way to go, but sometimes that is the appropriate response. And the heart of God, I mean, what we know about God is that God works in restorative ways. Jesus on the cross is God's restorative justice, always bringing us back. And God being who he is, I believe that God regularly worked in Adoni-Bezek's life to try to bring him back to himself, to convict him of how he was treating his prisoners. But after he had refused 70 times over, God says, enough is enough, and you're going to get back exactly what you did to 70 others. It's hard to understand that. I get it. Something to add to your thought process. Here's something more. The book of Judges takes place as God's people are going into the land we refer to as Canaan, the land that God had promised to their ancestor Abraham that would be his inheritance. And God says to the people here, go in there, and to Joshua as well, go in there and drive the people out and then set up your land there. And we say, why are they going in and occupied territory and driving these people out? These people are just, they're just quiet peasant farm life, setting up their, just living their lives. But they weren't. When we read from scholars and historians about the culture and the lifestyle of people that lived in Canaan at this time, we discover that it was dark, violent, perverted, full of pain and injustice. And scholars say that if the Israelites would have gone in, they would have, and just kind of lived next to them and been nice to their neighbors, they would have been sucked into the violence and the destruction, and they'd just, as a society, they would have basically ceased to exist. That was the darkness and the level of evil in Canaan at the time. Let me tell you just about a couple of them. Way more than just, like cutting off the thumbs and big toes of kings who were captured. They had a religion of gods and goddesses. That was, of course, their own kind of invented religion. And the stories we read about their gods and goddesses show that their gods and goddesses were evil and violent and often mixed very twisted, violent sexuality with fighting and wars and deception. And that's how their gods and goddesses lived. And if that's how your god and goddesses lived, then that kind of gives you permission to live that way as well. There were temples in which they worshiped, but really the temples were more like brothels, and their priests and priestesses were male and female prostitutes. And the way you worshiped was to go to the temple and worship with the priest or priestess. You can just take wherever your mind goes, that's what it was. Human rights advocates would tell us that prostitution is almost never the pretty woman version where an innocent woman makes a couple of bad choices and stumbles into it, but is almost always forced slavery, and where the prostitutes are forced into this terrible, awful, violent lifestyle. There are still places around the world where this kind of cultic ritual prostitution takes place, and in those cases, it almost always, there are girls who are sold to the temple by their families trying to make a living. And it's terrible, and it's awful, and it's violent, and it's sickening, and it's evil, and it's dark. And that was the world of ancient Canaan that the Israelites went into. It didn't stop there. They had one of their gods was named Moloch. Moloch is symbolized by this beastly character with long horns and fire in his belly. And the way you worshiped Moloch was to offer one of your children as a burnt sacrifice to Moloch. And so if you were going to war and you wanted Moloch to fight on your behalf, because that's what gods do, you sacrifice one of your children as a burnt offering to Moloch. If there's a bad famine and you really need it to rain and you need Moloch to interact with the other gods so that they'll send some rain, sacrifice a child to Moloch. I mean, after all, if we sacrifice the 4-year-old, at least the 12, 16, and 18-year-olds can eat, right? In fact, almost anything that you needed from the gods, Moloch could take care of at the cost of one of your children sacrificed to him. And this was the ritual and the belief and the culture that the Israelites were going into. This is what Canaan looked like. And so God says, don't even get close to this evil, vile, dark, violent, aggressive, oppressive culture. Have nothing to do it. In fact, drive them out. And we're going to set things up my way. So it kind of changes things when we know the background to the story, doesn't it? And all of a sudden, these stories that seem so extreme, well, they don't seem quite as extreme given the situation. Skip ahead to chapter 3. Let's read one of the episodes here. Chapter 3, verse 12, we read this. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. And the Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Now, it's really easy to just kind of continue on in the story and pass over that fact and just read through it really quickly. But when you live this story, 18 years of oppression is a long time, especially when the king and his people who oppressing you are the people we just described. I mean, think about 18 years of your life. This is 2018, so think back if you can remember to the turn of the millennium when we were celebrating, Y2K 2000. From then all the way until now, there is oppression of your people, of our people, by violent, vile, evil kings and their people. And life is hard. And they regularly come in and they steal your crops and you go hungry. They regularly come in and demand high taxes and tribute paid to them for protection. And there are stories of children and wives mysteriously disappearing, never to be seen from again, and you know what has happened. How long do you put up with some of this before you say enough is enough? We've lost too many of our people. How long do you put up with it before you fight back? Here's the third thing you should write down today to help you think through this issue. At some point, it becomes immoral not to resist a predator. Essentially, what we're dealing with today is this tension between hearing what Jesus said when he said, when someone attacks you, when someone strikes you on the cheek, rather than to fight back, offer them the other cheek. Turn the other cheek and allow them to strike you. Bless those who persecute you. Pacifists would take that to understand that Jesus says it is immoral always to fight back, to resist, to have anything to do with any kind of violence is immoral. Now, they make a good point. I think we need to listen. I don't really land there, but if you land there, I can respect that as long as you've thought through, and this is all part of your thought process, okay? But here we got to think. At some point, doesn't it become immoral not to resist a predator? In the 1930s and 40s, Christians had to work through this one as Adolf Hitler is marching across Europe. And they had to ask themselves, how many millions of people have to die before it becomes immoral not to stand up and go after this guy? You've got to wrestle with that one. Miroslav Volf is in the world of theology, is a well-known, well-read theologian. He kind of wrestles with this question from his own perspective. Here's what he says. I used to think that the wrath of God was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. Here he tells his own story here. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed, and over 3 million were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed. My people were shelled day in and day out. Some of them were brutalized beyond imagination. And I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to that carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrator's basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. Let's add another thought to the list here today. And that is, there is a difference between personal revenge and protecting others. It's really easy to think that that all violence is okay and is out of bounds. That oversimplifies it a little too much, though. What Jesus is essentially talking about is when someone attacks you, do not attack them back, because we know that's going to be an emotional reaction to get revenge. Even if you call it justice, let's just call it what it is. It's taking revenge because you feel like it, because you've been hurt and embarrassed or whatever. We've got to separate the difference, though, between personal revenge and protecting others. You see, the stories we see here, the rest of the story here, even though Ehud makes some bad decisions, and the other folks that we're going to see in the book of Judges make some bad decisions and don't always do things the right way, their goal was not always, and especially in Ehud's case right here today, he was not taking personal revenge on some people. He saw himself as defending and protecting his people who had for 18 long years been oppressed and brutalized. And so we're not talking about taking personal revenge here. That's off the table. That's out of bounds. What we're talking about here is protecting others. And for sure, warriors and fighters do not see themselves as taking personal revenge, but doing it to protect others. Let's keep reading the rest of the story. Pick it up at verse 15. So 18 long years, right? Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. Here's where the story gets good. Check this out. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about 18 inches long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. And after Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon, and he said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." And the king said to his attendants, "Leave us." And they left. You see the story developing? This getting good, right? He's going back. And he was like really, really smart because he was a left-handed warrior, because the Benjamites, they trained to be especially strong in their left hand so that they could have the upper hand in hand-to-hand combat. And so he has also fashioned a knife just the right size with a double-edged blade, and he has put it on the inside of his right thigh because he knew that if he was going to be, patted down by the guards, they wouldn't pat down his right thigh, because nobody would ever put a knife or weapon there, because nobody's good with their right hand. They would do it on the other leg. But he had worked his whole plan out and used his strengths to his advantages and all that. And now he's like, "I've got a secret message for you." And the king's like, "I want to hear a secret message." And he sends his guards away, and now it's just the two of them together in his throne room. And check out what happens here. Where were we? Verse 20. So Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace, and he said, "I have a message from God for you." And as the king rose from his seat, verse 21, Ehud reached with his left hand. He drew the sword from his right thigh, and he plunged it into the king's belly. We're going to stop there for now. But let me tell you, especially if you like the movie Commando or Ninjas or whatever, this is like, this is, you bookmark it and come back and read it later. I just don't want to read the rest of it because, like Judy and Lorena, they just probably, it might be a little too much for them. They might get a little bit embarrassed at this level of violence being, read in church. But it's really, even though it's the Bible. So, to honor them, we'll just bookmark this and you come back to it later. But you got to read this, because when, if the 12-year-old in me is like, "That's awesome," and it's totally disgusting. And, there's some bathroom humor in there too that I don't know how it made it in the Bible, but God doesn't whitewash history, right? You got to check it out. However, even though there's lots of intrigue here and it's a really well-told story, he did lie and deceive and trick, and we don't really endorse that type of activity, do we? Does the Bible really say that all of that activity was okay? And you might say, "Yeah, it did, because I read the end of the story already, and it says that after this, then he kills the king, and he sneaks out, he locks the door, sneaks out the back window, shimmies down the drain pipe, runs down, gets his friends, and they bring an army back, and they defeat the Moabites and Eglon's army, and they push them back." And it says at the end of the story, they enjoyed peace for 80 years. 80 years of peace? Isn't that worth a little bit of lie and deception? Are you telling me that the end always justifies the means? Even if the means are untruthful, sinful, deceptive? Because you know what happens? We idolize our heroes. We tend to imitate our heroes. You know how it goes, right? That maybe down the road in those 80 years, there was another father who was working a deal. He's trying to land this big contract, and he knew that if he could land the contract, that it would set his family up for success. And after all, I got 4 daughters. I want to put them through college, and if I just get this to sign, it's going to set us up. We're going to be set. We're going to be good. And it's expensive to pay for college these days. And if I just tell a couple of little lies and a little bit of half truths and just get them to sign this deal, my family's important, right? Taking care of my kids is important, right? Ehud did it. The end justifies the means, right? Here's what we need to understand as we read through the book of Judges. Fifth thing you can write down today. While God chooses leaders, he does not always approve of all of their decisions and actions. What we see here is God raises up some leaders for a specific task to drive out the oppressors. That does not mean just because God has selected a leader that he endorses all of their choices, all of their behaviors, or every other part of their life. In fact, what we're going to find in the book of Judges is that while the Canaanites were evil, the Israelites, God's people, were just a little bit less evil. And it's part of the sadness of the story and the lesson that we need to learn. Just because you call yourself God's person doesn't automatically excuse all of your behavior and all of your choices. In fact, what we see in the book of Judges is we see God choosing the best of what he had to work with, and he didn't have much to work with. We see God choosing the best tool to get the job done, but really none of the tools were all that great. And these leaders were extremely flawed, at times even extremely sinful, which sets up the story for the ultimate Savior, the ultimate rescue in Jesus Christ, the perfect Savior, the perfect rescue. What we see here is a very elementary view of justice. You see, we fast forward the story about 1,200 years, and Jesus comes along, and he says, I want you to think about a more mature, grown-up version of justice. My 8-year-old, he has an elementary view of justice. You know what justice is for the 8-year-old? If you hit me, I hit you back, now we're even, justice has been taken care of. That's an elementary view of justice. You take a bite out of my cookie, I take a bite out of your cookie. I don't care if we throw them all away in the end. At least we're even. And we see some of that in the Old Testament for sure. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And when justice was carried out in local, tribal ways of doing societies, ways of doing justice, that's kind of, kept things leveled the playing field, right? You hit me, I hit you back. But here's what we know, if we're honest, is it never really ends there, does it? That if you hit me and I have the right to hit you back, and so I do because I have the right to hit you back, most of us will never just stop it right there and say, okay, now we're even. Because now we've gotten ourselves into a fight. And so what happens? You hit me and I hit you back. And now we're both mad at each other. So you hit me back because I hit you. And so then because you hit me and I hit you back and you hit me again, I'm in a one down position. So I hit you back again. And we just keep hitting each other. And now it's turned into a fight. And it doesn't end until one of us is just exhausted or too quit or just quits and gives up. Or unless someone says, enough is enough. Let's stop this madness. You go beyond a personal level when this is tribes, countries, nations. And one invades the other. And so then they attack and retaliate. It never stops there, does it? Because when the next generation grows up who lost their fathers and uncles, they're still mad and they want their revenge and they attack again and counterattack. And it just continues and continues, and the cycle of violence continues. So folks will talk about the myth of redemptive violence, that violence in and of itself is never redemptive. It just kind of settles the score for a little while, but never really brings about a good ending. And Jesus comes along and he says, let's get honest, that the cycle of violence doesn't really work, does it? And he says, let's grow up into a more mature version of justice in human relationships. And he says, how about this? How about when someone attacks you and strikes you on your cheek and embarrasses you among your friends and humiliates you? Even though you have the right to strike them in return and settle the score, you know it's not going to work, don't you? What if, rather than allowing that person to control you and to say, I struck them back because I had to, they hit me first? What if you were to stand your ground and say, you hit me first, but you know what? I'm the bigger person. I don't have to hit you back. That would be an emotional reaction to get even because I feel like it, and I'll just justify it by saying that it's justice. But you know what? I'll be the bigger person in this situation. I don't have to fight back. In fact, I'm not going to be a victim, and I'm not powerless over you, and you don't have power over me. You don't force me to hit you back. You may hit me, but I'm not a victim. I'm not powerless. I'm going to remain in control of myself, and I will stand here and choose to refuse to hit you back because I'm not a victim and I'm not powerless. Jesus says, now that's true power. That is restraint, and that stops the cycle of violence before it ever gets started. Is that not a better way? That's a hard truth to buy into. Christians wrestled with that. The Apostle Paul wrestled with that. And so we find in the book of Romans, which is some of the most developed theology that comes several decades after Jesus, we see the Apostle Paul wrestling with some of this, and he says, here's what this looks like in our daily lives. Let's just try to live the Jesus way. He pushes it even farther and says, not only should we not strike back, but how about this? Romans chapter 4, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless them and do not curse them. Rather than just not curse back, what if we were to go one step and bless them in return? Verse 19, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. In other words, saying, God's smarter than I am. He knows the best what to do, so I'll let him take care of it. Verse 20, on the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him something to drink, and in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Try that. But Jason, come on now. Imagine if everybody lived that way. There is a criminal element in society that would discover that, and they would make the most of that, and they would manipulate that for all it's worth. We can't all live this way. The Apostle Paul is smart enough to know that. And so he continues on. Chapter 13, verse 1. He says, here's also how we live. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. In other words, obey those who are in power. Skip down to verse 4. For the one in authority, governors, police officers, law enforcement. The one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. And so, in the morals and ethics of Jesus, there is still someone who carries a weapon and who forcefully maintains justice and coerces justice and deals with this criminal element, if you will. But unless you carry a badge, unless you've been deputized and authorized and you are one of these people, that's not you. Your job, you've been empowered, is to forgive, to bless, to encourage. You don't have to take revenge because God's provided for justice to happen. One of the takeaways here is if we take this serious, that we are to honor, to encourage, to pray for law enforcement officers, for our military men and women, who are the ones who carry the sword. Because while I'm neither a veteran nor been an officer, I've heard stories. I've heard stories of brave men and women who would tell us that when you carry the sword, even when you're an authorized agent who carries a weapon, that comes with a burden. That this whole issue of violence and the destructive nature of the cycle of violence and why you don't want to come anywhere close to it is told in the stories of the heroes who have fought to defend our freedoms, who carry a heavy burden, who carry memories that they cannot get out of their head no matter how much they would like to, who carry wounds and scars more than just physical, who would say that the flashbacks are real and that the survivor guilt is real, that they feel guilty, that they were able to come home when so many of their brothers and sisters in arms weren't able to come home. They carry the heavy burden that is a part of getting close to violence and defending freedom and defending against aggressors. My friends who've been a career in law enforcement have told me how hard it is to not let their hearts become cynical and hard as day in and day out they're faced and forced to deal with the reality and the darkness of sin and pain and violence every day so that the rest of us don't have to. Which illustrates the last thing we're going to land on that I want you to go home with today. Right in the middle of these two sections here, the Apostle Paul tells us this. I want you to read it out loud with me. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The reality of evil is when you get close to it, whether you're participating in it or defending from it, you got to get close to it, and it's so easy to become overcome by it that he says, don't even go near it, but rather, here is our response, you and I. Let's overcome every evil with good. And so when you are met with the face of aggression and violence, overcome it with good. That is why you can bless your enemies and you can pray for those who persecute you, because we're overcoming evil with good, which is, by the way, exactly what Jesus Christ did for us. And that the good news of Jesus that brings us all together is that Jesus, the Son of God, left the comfort and the beauty of heaven to come down and be with us. And he did not bring the wrath and punishment that we rightly deserve because of the sins we've committed, which, by the way, you've forgotten far more sins than you even can remember. But rather than bring the wrath that we deserved, he brought the grace and mercy that we don't deserve. And rather than us dying for our own sins, Jesus died on our behalf so that we don't have to. And that we can have forgiveness and a relationship with God today because Jesus died on our behalf. The good news of Jesus is the grace of God in which Jesus was not overcome, but he overcame evil with good. And when he invites us to love our enemies and to turn the other cheek, he's only asking us to do what he has already done for us. It's a hard teaching, but it starts with the goodness of the grace of God. Let's go to God. Let's talk to God about it. Bow your heads with me. It's not an easy teaching to hear. So however you respond to the Lord with this today, I want you just to talk to God about it now. Lord, I pray today for the person who's in a situation where they feel like taking revenge. Oh God, would you enable them to respond with grace and kindness? For those who are protectors, oh Lord, keep their hearts soft towards you. God, I pray that you would take our hearts and minds, and that you would just be so close, even as we sort through some difficult issues and a difficult subject. Lord, I pray that we would find our peace in you. Lord, you overcame evil and darkness as you gave your life. And my prayer today is that all of us here today would know the freedom and the forgiveness and the cleansing power of your presence in our lives, and that we would not go home carrying guilt and shame with us, but Lord, that we'd find freedom in you today, Lord Jesus. So if that's you today, let me just talk to you for a minute. Carrying some guilt and shame, carrying some confusion, even some anger with God for what's happened to you. I want to encourage you today. Jesus has his arm stretched out to you, and he says, take my hand, let me lead you. Let me forgive you, let me clean you up, let me provide the peace that you've been looking for your whole life. You'll find it only in Jesus. If you're that soldier who's carried guilt and memories and pain, and you stuffed it or medicated it with some type of a substance, you'll never find peace without Jesus. Well, he's not going to fix everything completely perfect right away, but you'll never find peace without Jesus. I'm going to encourage you today. Jesus has his hand out to you. Take his hand, follow him, invite him into your life, let's just see what God does in your own heart and life. God, you're reaching out to us. We're reaching back to you. You gave your life to us. We give ours to you, Lord. Do a great work in us. May we go home this week and live out these hard truths by your power as we live for you, Lord Jesus, and discover your way is always the best way. Let's stand together. Sing one more song and then we'll go. I'm sorry we're running so late today, but let's just give a couple more minutes. Say praise to the Lord, find our strength in him, and then let's go out and by God's power live it this week and just see for ourselves that God's way is best. Here we go. Let's sing. Worship team, lead us out as you lead us to the throne of Jesus.